Around the world, various countries are granting new COVID emergency powers. But when will these powers be repealed? And are we on the brink of creating a forever emergency where new powers are perpetuated in order to increase the power of already powerful institutions? The Scottish Government wants its emergency coronavirus powers to become permanent, including the ability to impose lockdowns and restrict gatherings so long as they believe it is necessary and proportionate. There are two words that are open to interpretation. This is necessary. Who says? I do. And it's proportionate. Who says? I do. The majority of the government's current powers introduced during the pandemic are due to elapse in March 2022, although they can be extended by 6 months. Why is that not enough? Why do you want to have that forever? Can you not see that that could be draconian, disadvantageous to the population? How often do you need to be reminded that the government are meant to work for you? It's like, just seems like a weird abstract notion. You think of them as sort of kings and queens, don't you? You don't think, oi, you lot, sort the bins out. Sort the bins out. You think of us, oh no, they're coming. They're spying on my phone. They're going to kill us. You know, that's not what it should feel like. One recent study found even as crime levels fell during the first lockdown, stop and search more than doubled. So crime is down, stop and search is up. Interesting. Police forces tried banning Easter eggs as a non-essential good. Oi, is that an essential Easter egg? Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's from my grandson. Put that down! Holy shit, there's Maltesers inside! Stand back, Sergeant! Stand back! Police also started to inspect shopping trolleys. They're safer anyway, just watch them as they go by. Under the Coronavirus Act, they require more power to remove or detain any suspected infectious person. What? For a symptomless disease? That person's symptomless! Nick 'em! Yet, during the first lockdown, every single person that this measure was used against in England and Wales was wrongfully charged. Meanwhile, a new election bill infringes on the right to vote by introducing the requirement to show voter ID in a bid to tackle the near non-existent problem of voter fraud. Oh no! There's a problem so small we can hardly even see it. Oh shit, what are we going to do? Obviously, this legislation will disproportionately affect minority and working class Britons without photo ID. Oh, well, there you go. This is an amazing article by Luke Kemp, Research Associate at the Centre for Study of Existential Risk at the University in Cambridge, talking more broadly about emergency legislation that's brought in around COVID and its misuse and potential ongoing misuse. He says, a total of 32 countries have used military or military ordinances to enforce rules, which has not been without casualties. To monitor rule breakers, 22 countries have used surveillance drones. Face recognition programs have been expanded. Internet censorship has occurred in 28 countries and internet shutdowns in 13. At least 120 contact tracing apps are in use across 71 states and 60 other digital contact tracing measures have been used across 38 countries. Are you getting any idea of the scale and impact of these measures? If you introduce a piece of legislation or a regulatory measure under the idea that there's an emergency and we've got to deal with the emergency, like, think about how you work as an individual. If someone scares you or fills you up with desire, an aspect of your biochemistry is activated that is usually dormant. When I'm frightened, I overreact. That's why road rages happen. Because in the back of your mind, you're aware, if I crash, I'm going to die, I'm going to kill these people I'm with or these people I don't know. So you are more easily triggered. What happened in the case of emergency legislation is your fear state is heightened, and during this heightened state of stress, new measures are introduced. Pavlov talked about this. He of the dribbling dogs spoke about, if you want to condition people, condition them under stress. Think about how military are trained. If you've been in the military, you will know that part of your training is to receive instruction under stress. Think of what's happening now on the international scale. People are frightened, terrified for their lives, the lives of their loved ones, mistrustful of other people, all these fissures and divisions in society. And into this comes apparent emergency legislation, and forgive me for saying, often brought about by governments that I don't have a great deal of trust or faith in. Legally, emergency powers vary by country. Many are enshrined under a constitution that gives specific powers to executives and require a time limit. Many, but not all, require the declaration of a state of emergency. According to data from the CoronaNet database, 124 countries declared a state of emergency during 2020 in response to COVID-19, with another several declaring emergencies in specific provinces or municipalities. Even prior to the pandemic, pandemic, many countries existed in a perpetual state of emergency. The US does not have a separate regime for emergencies. Instead, presidents can activate national emergencies to gain access to a range of 136 statutory emergency powers. As of February 2020, there were 32 active national emergencies, the oldest of which dates back 39 years. If an emergency ain't happened within 39 years, I'm sensing there's an emergency on the horizon. Yep, looks like that emergency's coming. Oh, damn body oatmeal. If something ain't happened in 39 years, that's not an emergency, is it? I wish it'd hurry up. In 2001, the US Patriot Act allowed the US Congress itself to expand surveillance powers. Some scholars labelled this the legislative model. We all know that in 2001, the Patriot Act meant that there was much more surveillance. Still, the fallout to this day is being discussed, whether it's WikiLeaks or Edward Snowden. But the impact of that piece of legislation, which follows the template emergency, necessary response, refusal to revoke those powers even though the emergency seems to have depleted, desisted. Perhaps more worrying is what can be called emergency responses, exceptional legislation that is not designated as an emergency power but is either passed during or in reaction to a threat. Many of the counter-terrorism acts passed in the UK during the last 2 decades were ordinary legislation but would make most emergency powers seem tame. Big tech is joined by a cabal of intelligence agencies across the world who have gathered more data and power over the past decade. There is surprisingly little evidence to support the effectiveness of mass surveillance in combating terrorists or viruses. For contact tracing apps, we don't know how effective they are, mainly due to a lack of data. Nonetheless, surveillance remains a go-to response when a disaster hits. So it doesn't help particularly with terrorism. It doesn't help particularly with viruses. How is it beneficial? The tendency for systems of power is to preserve and increase their own power where possible. So if something comes along, I almost don't blame them. The same way I was saying, like, that we as individuals, if we experience fear, are likely to respond less rationally because of the adrenaline and various other hormones that flood our consciousness. The biochemical reaction overwhelms us. Perhaps it's the same with the shared mind of a state institution. They are unable to think straight. They're unable to say, look, this doesn't help with terrorism. This doesn't help with viruses. Let's not do it. Let's prioritise liberty and individual freedom, the kind of motifs and ideologies upon which our countries are built, over this knee-jerk response, which might look to the casual observer like a mad power grab and increasing our own ability to impose dominion over the domestic population. Are all the measures introduced during the coronavirus pandemic necessary? It appears not. A recent review of the effectiveness of COVID-19 response measures published in Nature Human Behaviour ranked police and army interventions, surveillance and the activation of emergency responses in the bottom 7 of 20 surveyed measures. They don't even work. And the people imposing them, the institutions, governments, states imposing them, know that they don't work. This should not be surprising. There's emerging evidence that emergency powers are usually used to benefit governments rather than save lives. One study of natural disasters and the use of constitutional emergency provisions found the more powers given to the executive, the higher the body count. Any of you that have read Naomi Klein's book, Shock Doctrine, or seen the documentary of the same name, will be familiar with this pattern of using emergency and in some cases even creating an emergency in order to create legislation and therefore more control is a common traditional tactic practiced in particular by the United States against their neighbours in the South, what was known as Latin America. Of course, I'm not suggesting that's what's happening in this instance, merely that it does seem to follow that paradigm. Many of the current COVID-19 measures are an acceleration of pre-existing trends. Reporters Without Borders noted countries with already heavy suppression of media freedom tended to use the coronavirus as an opportunity to intensify their censorial efforts. So it's not like everything was tickety-boom and wonderful and all of a sudden here come these measures. No, there's a trend anyway, and this increases or hastens that tendency. One study found that 87% of the global population is now living in countries which can be considered repressed, closed or obstructed. That's outrageous. That's global state totalitarianism that's been described, which most of us still think of as something to be afraid of, some harbinger, something of which we are being warned, rather than a state within which 87% of the population already reside. COVID-19 is not an outlier, but another push down a path many people are already being dragged down. That's extraordinary, isn't it? To sort of put COVID-19 and this apparently unique and anomalous information into a different rubric and context, i.e. one that is happening anyway, that it looks advantageous, that Whatever you think about the origins of the virus, the legislation around it, it seems that it's advantageous to the powerful. One thing I always think is, if a situation is beneficial to the most powerful interests in the world, how are you ever going to prevent that from happening? How are you ever going to repeal it? Because it's just beneficial. The greatest danger is that these become a state of exception in which a government transcends the rule of law. The entire Third Reich occurred during a state of emergency that lasted 12 years. It began in 1933 after Hitler invoked Article 48 of the Weimar Republic, allowing for the emergency decrease without parliamentary approval. Luckily, that state of emergency never led to Hitler. That guy was terrible. Emergency powers tend to go one way, top down. During an emergency, the knee-jerk reaction is always to reinforce those atop hierarchies in the state and significantly curtail the freedoms, voice and agency of citizens, often in a draconian fashion. Politicians continue to play to fears that during times of disaster, people will descend into a chaotic mess. Yet the overwhelming scientific and historical evidence contradicts this pessimistic view of humanity. Scholars in disaster risk management have now debunked the idea of mass citizen panic as a myth that rarely occurs. As Rebecca Solnit in A Paradise Built in Hell and Rutger Bregman in Humankind have documented, communities tend to display altruism and self-organisation in times of catastrophe. It's necessary for us to believe that what the government protect us from are each other and mad impulses and instincts within ourselves. We have granted them sovereignty over us because we can't be trusted. The other can't be trusted. We live in a fearful, dangerous world. When the evidence suggests the contrary is true, think of your own life. If you see someone suffering or struggling, what do you think? Oh, brilliant, I'll nick their wallet, or I'll take this opportunity to kill them. Or do you think, oh, I better help this person? When we're generally around one another, our tendency is to help one another, to cooperate, to coordinate. None of us is perfect. We can be competitive, and many of us, certainly myself, are flawed individuals capable of making errors and mistakes. But what we are building and what we're racing towards with terrifying pace is a situation where ordinary people have no power, where the possibility to act on our higher nature is being separated from us, denied us, where we are living under a state of totalitarianism, which is the living embodiment and the legal realization of the worst aspects of our nature. Fear, dread, terror, competition, repression, oppression. This has never played out well historically, and there's no reason to believe that it will play out well now. This tendency towards kindness and community, the writer of notes, can be seen from the very beginning of COVID-19, from hackathons to create low-cost PPE to community-organised efforts to protect the vulnerable. Instead, it is the government and military overreach that tends to worsen disasters. My intuition and my experience tells me that centralised power is beneficial to the people that are at the very centre of those structures and systems of power. Generally speaking, shared power, localised power, community power, individual liberty are beneficial to the individual and community. Just think about it for a moment. Where do you want power and authority? Over there, centralised, where all it can ever do is crush you in under the pretense and guise of protecting you, or for the individual, for the community, where you can meaningfully use power, whether we're talking about resources, the ability to make legislation, the ability to decide which freedoms to prioritise, which rules and values to promote. The further from you the ability to make decisions moves, the worse the kind of culture you're living in will become. It seems unavoidable to conclude from the brilliant writing that we've looked at today that coronavirus 19 and the legislation around it is being used to further entrench and centralise power and to usher in legislation and systems of governance that are not beneficial to ordinary people and not even beneficial to solving the very problem they're being introduced to address. Thank you for watching this. If you've got any comments, please comment below. Give us a thumbs up, a like, share it around, communicate with people. Please sign up to my mailing list, russellbrand.com, in case I can't communicate directly to you for some reason in the future. If you want to hear me have longer conversations, go over to Apple and sign up to Luminary, the podcast network, where my under the skin conversations with brilliant thinkers are available, one per week, along with a meditation above the noise. If you don't want to pay for stuff, have a look at this video where I talk about a similar subject. Or if you want to learn meditation, go over to my side channel, Awakening. Subscribe there. You need to do both. You need to be aware, educated and awakened. Thank you.